I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Tonight, I'm going to dedicate the webinar to Hezbollah, starting with where we are and then going back. Where we are is that in the aftermath of the elimination of Fuad Shukr and Ismail Haniyeh, Shukr in Beirut and Haniyeh in Tehran on the same evening, and all of its friends, proxies, agents, and the like have threatened a massive. To understand what all of that means, let's start with the elimination of what happened that night, and then from there, break, because the two, even though they were connected time-wise, were in a strange sort of way not connected in an operational sense. So Fuad Shukr, the erstwhile head of the operations of Hezbollah, not their chief of staff, as was often said, the chief of staff or the leader of Hezbollah remains Hassan Nasrallah. He's the ultimate final word on everything that happens within Hezbollah, although not to Hezbollah, and we'll see that in a moment. America's list as well as Israel's list for a very, very long time. He was one of the people, he wasn't number one, he was number two in the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in the early 1980s. His boss, Imad Murnia, was taken out about 15 years ago in Damascus, and he got promoted the hard way, or maybe for him the easy way, to become number one. But he was involved in that as well. Taking him out in Beirut, ostensibly as a response to the rocket attack that killed 12 children in Majd al-Shams, but really because he's been on the list for a very, very long time, was one that America found very difficult to condemn, since America had a $5 million reward out for information on his whereabouts. By the way, I'm willing to collect the reward. I know exactly where he is right now, after his funeral. That same evening, Ismail Haniyeh was taken out in Tehran. Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, the leader of the entire organization of Hamas, in a hit that was actually planned for May. There was a lot of headline. Why did Netanyahu decide to do it now? And the answer is because he could. In May, there was a plan to get him when he was at the funeral of the previous president of Iran, whose helicopter didn't make it through the mountains. But the decision was made not to do it then because there were too many civilians in the area, and there would have been too many civilian casualties. So it happened the night that it happened, once again, because he was there, it was available, the green light was given, and by really operational coincidence, the two of them were taken out on the same night. Now, what connects them is that while Shukr was Hezbollah and Haniyeh was Hamas, the fact that Haniyeh was taken out in Tehran actually fuses the two into one merry mess for the Iranians. So that's where we stand at the moment. There's a lot of question what's going to be and when is going to be, and I will repeat something that I've said many times in the past and preempt questions of this type for the future. I don't do prophecy. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen the day after tomorrow. I'm a disciple of two great political philosophers, Winston Churchill and Yogi Berra, and they both said it's best to prophesy about things that have already happened, and I try to follow that as best I possibly can. So what'll be tomorrow, we'll get up in the morning and we'll see. But in order to really understand what's going on and to, I think, deflect some of the nonsense that's going around both in the media and in the halls of politics in this country, a bit more in the West, in America in particular, I think it's important to understand who these guys are and where they come from. I'm a great believer in understanding context. I'm also a great believer in the famous and often misquoted saying by Santayana, that is, he who cannot remember the past is condemned to repeat it. That's the exact quote, by the way. Knowing the past and knowing how we got to where we are is very important. So let's delve into who these guys are. What is this Hezbollah? If you read articles, and you might be able to see that I've got a couple of books on the subject over my shoulder. By the way, that's not a screenshot. They're real books. I've even read one or two of them. Most of the literature, scholarly, political, and media, if you look at it, describing Hezbollah, it's reminiscent of the parable of the blind men trying to describe an elephant. One blind man feels a leg and says an elephant is a tree. Another one feels the ears and says it's like flapping leaves, etc., etc. And you'll see articles that Hezbollah is a Lebanese organization, but it's an Iranian organization. It's an Islamic organization, but it's a national organization. It's a terrorist organization, but it's a militia. It's a political organization. And the fact is, it's all of the above. Its core root is in Shiism. And in order to understand that, we have to go back, first of all, to who the Shiites are and where they came from. Second, Lebanese Shiism, which is an important historical political branch of Shiism in general, and Khomeini Shiism, which is different Shiism in general. And here, for those who don't quite get it, not every Shiite in the world is a follower of Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, let's get back to that. Who are the Shiites? When Muhammad died in the 7th century, there was a split within the Muslim world, a political split, although they would argue it was theological. His son-in-law, Ali, and his followers argued that the only succession, what was called Arabic, the Khalif, for those who understand Hebrew, the Khalif, to replace, to change. The Khalif must be a descendant of the Prophet. Now, even though Ali wasn't a descendant, he was married to the Prophet's daughter Fatima, close enough as far as they were concerned, and they established a branch of Islam that was originally referred to as Shiat Ali, the partisans or the followers of Ali, and Shiat Ali became the Shia, the Shiites, the partisans, the followers. The rest of Islam, who were not members of Muhammad's family, didn't really like that idea. So they followed a fellow named Abu Bakr. The names here aren't all that critically important, and went into conflict with the Shiites. Ultimately, the Sunnis, that is the followers of Abu Bakr, won. If for no other reason, they greatly, greatly outnumbered the Shiites. In the course of their history, the Shiites had 12 leaders, imams, all of whom were killed. Not a single one, I should say up until the 12th, of the first 11, not a single imam, leader of the Shiites, died a natural death. They were killed in battle. I'll come back to one of those in particular because he's important to our story, or murdered, and in a few cases poisoned by their wives. I won't go into marital issues here. The most important death of those first 11 was that of Hussein, who was venerated by the Shiites, who died in the Battle of Karbala in the year 680. He and a small group were surrounded by Abu Bakr and chose to fight to the death, martyr themselves, rather than dishonor themselves and surrender. That sets the model for Shiite, in other words, venerating Hussein, venerating his death, and symbolizing it as a critical part of Shiite belief. It's carried out just recently. It was the date, for those who don't know, the Muslim calendar doesn't track with the solar calendar, so their months flow through the year. This year, celebration or commemoration of Ashura took place recently, and it's celebrated by self-flagellation, cutting their heads so that blood can run down, beating themselves with whips. An interesting aside is that Ashura has actually found its origins in the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the 10th of Tishrei, but they took the Jewish idea of what is translated from Hebrew as torturing your soul into self-flagellation and torturing of themselves. And it's a bloody ritual. Anybody who's got the stomach for it is cordially invited to look it up. I'm sure there are all sorts of clips all over that you can see. Not recommended for children. The 12th Imam, remember the first 11 were killed. The 12th Imam, their belief is that when he disappeared, he went into hiding. It's called the stage of occultation. It took place in 873 or 4. And their belief is that he is still alive in hiding, waiting to reappear and lead the Shiites to the great and glorious victory and establish their rule on earth. In the meantime, while he's in hiding, he rules through messengers. He is a direct link to Allah, and he rules the world through his messengers. Now, I want you to hold that thought, because when I get to Khomeini, I'm going to come back to this. Messengers aren't always known. They aren't always clear, but his message is always being gotten out through some imam or another, according to the general belief of the Shiites. From there, let's go to Lebanon. And again, I'm touching on this. Each one of these topics can be an entire course, 45 minutes or so. I'm not going to go into that much depth or detail, although I will do podcasts covering each of these in somewhat more extensively. The Shiites in Lebanon suffered from the rise of the Mamluks with the defeat of the Crusaders from the end of the 13th century. The Mamluks were Sunni and not very nice people. The Crusaders found that out as well. They were thrown out by the Ottomans in the early 50s. The Ottomans are also Sunni, not very nice to their opponents. And the Shiites of Lebanon suffered terribly all through the period from the end of the 13th century until the Ottomans were defeated and thrown out, and Lebanon became French. 18. With the rise of the French brought Western ideas into Lebanon, the ideas of parliament and democracy and division. They tried as much as they possibly could to elevate their guys, who were the Maronite Christians for the most part, but they understood they had to divide Lebanon up between the different sects, and in a series of accords and divisions starting in the 90s and ending in the 90s, they divided up the political structure of Lebanon between Christians, Muslims, and Druze. The Muslims they handed over to primarily were the Sunnis, and the Shiites got a very, very, very small portion of the political, something on the order of 4%. Now, that made sense in the 1920s when the Shiites made up less than 5% of the population of Lebanon. But by 1975, Shiites made up 30% of the population of Lebanon, and they were still only getting about 4% of the political pie. In 1975, Lebanon descended into a civil war, and all bets were off. Now, that's general Lebanese background. Backing up a step. In the 60s, under an imam named Musa, the Shiites began to organize first as social organizations, later as political organizations, and then ultimately as a military organization. Sadr was an imam, he was a Shiite, but he was not a Khomeiniist. And as a result, in 1978, he disappeared in Libya under orders to Gaddafi, and his body was never found. He is still today referred to as the hidden imam, with reference back to the 12th Imam, who's still in hiding as well. During that same period, in 1975, before his disappearance, he established a military organization, a militia called Amal. Anybody's been following politics in Lebanon and the civil war and the militia and Israel's engagement in Lebanon knows that Amal is one of those organizations that Israel had to deal with as well all through the 90s. Amal is Shiite, however, it is not Khomeiniist, and it tends toward secular. Now, here's something that we should understand, but we very often don't. An organization can have a religious designation. In other words, not every Jewish organization is a religious organization. Not every Christian organization is a religious organization. Well, not every Muslim or Shiite organization is a religious organization. And Amal is not. It's extremely Lebanese in its thinking, which makes it somewhat anti-Syrian, somewhat anti-Iranian, and somewhat anti-Israel, all because its focus is Lebanon, and it sees those and others as meddling in Lebanese politics. In 1979, Khomeini came to power, and very, very quickly after that, began to push in the direction of Lebanon. Now here, we have to pause for a moment. When Khomeini came to power, he had established the idea of an Islamic republic whose purpose was to spread Islam throughout the world. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the IRGC, often very, very commonly misreferred to as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The I in IRGC is Islamic. It is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and I say this advisedly, it is akin to the SS of Nazi Germany, whose purpose to defend and promote the ideology of the party. Now, along with that, Khomeini, as an Iranian, wanted to extend Persian influence. Okay, the Islamic and the Persian are different. They're separate, but he fused them. And here he had a problem, because the Iranians, as Persians, are not part of the Arab world. They're Muslim, but they're not Arab. In reaching out to the Lebanese, to the Shiites of Lebanon, he couldn't use Arab identity as the common. So instead, he used Islamic, specifically Shiite identity. Many of the Shiites of Lebanon, not all, but many, were Khomeinists. They had studied in the religious schools in Najaf that Khomeini ran, along with some of his compatriots. And they came out of it specifically as Khomeinists, and you'll see in a moment how significant that is when we talk about Khomeini and what he stood for. But in the meantime, in order to reach out into Lebanon, he simply could not co-opt Amal. He needed to create something new, and in doing so already in 1980, began organizing through the Revolutionary Guards, through the Iranian ambassador to Syria, in Damascus, a new organization that ultimately came to be called. If you look up Hezbollah in almost any of the works, I'm talking about the lightweight works, but even some of the scholarly ones, they'll say that it was established as a response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and that the invasion was in June. By July, the IRGC had set up training camps and established Hezbollah. Now, anyone who knows anything about organizations knows that you don't set up and begin training an organization in less than 4 weeks. The organization already existed. The Israeli invasion was a catalyst to allow the Iranians to get in and begin training them, which they did. And in 1982, Israel unknowingly, unwittingly, made the bad trade of throwing Arafat and the PLO out of Lebanon and getting Hezbollah in their place in the vacuum. One of the reasons that Khomeini wanted to push into Lebanon because there were other places that he could have moved as well. As we see today, there are Shiites in Iraq is a majority Shiite country. There are Shiites in Yemen, the Houthis. But Lebanon, for him, had a particular significance, and that is its access to Jerusalem. One of his purposes was for the jihad to liberate Jerusalem from the Jews. And in fact, Hezbollah was established based on three pillars. One, to establish an Iranian deterrent force against Israel, and we're seeing that today. One of the reasons that Israel thinks twice about going after Iranian targets, or did up until this past year with the eruption of fighting, was the possibility of a flare-up from Hezbollah. The second was to turn Lebanon into an Islamic state, which they haven't completely succeeded in doing, but they're working on it. And third was the jihad, destroy Israel. And here I cannot overemphasize the importance of understanding that Hezbollah's raison d'etre, its reason to exist, is to destroy Israel. I'm going to say this now just as an aside, bringing us up to date. All the talk of a ceasefire, of Hezbollah withdrawing a few kilometers from the border, and with that bringing peace to Israel's northern border, completely ignores the fact that Hezbollah exists to destroy Israel. It's not about Shabbat farms. It's not about a borderline here or there. And it's certainly not about an Israeli strike in one place or another. And incidentally, it has nothing to do with Gaza. Hezbollah is excellent at making excuses to hide its strategic goal. And I'll give you one interesting example. Hezbollah says it's going to fight to end the Israeli occupation. And everybody in the West says, oh, they're talking about the Israeli occupation of disputed Lebanese territory. No, they're not. They're talking about the occupation of Palestine and not the West Bank and Gaza. Their idea is Israel's existence, its occupation, and it needs to be eradicated. And that brings us to Khomeini. Because in order to understand Hezbollah, we have to understand a bit about Khomeini. And we can understand Khomeini very simply because he wrote his political and ideological and religious ideas down in a book called Islamic Government. It came out in English somewhere around 1970. It's up here somewhere. In Islamic Government, from our perspective, it's a huge book. It's filled with very intricate theological arguments, important ones if you're interested in the subject. But it boils down to two things. The first is radical idea that he bases in Muslim religious writings and thought of what he called walayat, the rule of the jurisprudent. Now, here I have to digress for a moment and give you a little bit of historical background of the Shiites and where Khomeini sort of steps into this and its importance. Up until Khomeini, because of their scattering and oppression, the Shiites of the world, primarily the Middle East, operated an extremely decentralized ruling system. In other words, each town, each city, each district had their own leaders. The leaders were, I'm talking about religious leaders, because religion and politics are not separate here. And they were in some loose contact with each other, but there was no pyramid hierarchy. In other words, it was much closer to, and I hate to draw these parallels, but I am forced to illustrate it quickly. It was much closer to Jewish diaspora organization, where each town would have its rabbi, and much less like Catholic organization with a centralized pope ruling over the entire. Khomeini argued that with the establishment of an Islamic republic, there should be a supreme leader, the jurisprudent, who is a religious leader, a religious scholar, but who is the ultimate authority on all things social, political, strategic, and religious. And all Shiites should follow him. A pope, if you will, but of the old school pope, the pre-Treaty of Westphalia pope, who was an important political actor, in addition to being a religious one throughout Europe and throughout the world. As I said before, not all the Shiites and not all the Shiite scholars bought this, but when Khomeini came to power in 1979 in Iran, he established himself as supreme leader. And he said very clearly, as supreme leader, the supreme leader receives their instruction from the hidden imam, the 12th imam, who gets his instructions directly from Allah. And therefore, disobeying the faqih, disobeying the supreme leader, is tantamount to disobeying Allah. Think about that for a moment. The leaders of Hezbollah are the disciples of Khomeini. And they followed him and continue to follow his successor, Khamenei, as the political, military, social leader because of his religious position. All three leaders of Hezbollah in its history have been clerics. By the way, Hezbollah is the only truly religious terrorist organization in the Muslim world, in the sense that it's a religious organization. It's not simply an organization of religious people. And that makes it very different from Hamas, as well as different from Al-Qaeda. The leaders, once again, the leaders of Hezbollah have been clerics. That includes Hassan Nasrallah. They are ordained clerics and ordained from the religious school of Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini appointed his successor, Ali Khamenei, and he is the supreme leader of Iran today. And by the way, here, let me just let that sink in for a moment. Since 1979 until today in 2024, there have been two leaders in Iran, Khomeini and Khamenei. Khamenei is the direct heir, descendant of Khomeini, which is why he's followed in the way that he's followed by organizations like Hezbollah. The second important point about Khomeini that's germane to our discussion is that he was a true, deep exterminationist anti-Semite. In the book that I mentioned, Islamic Government, page 1, paragraph 2, and I'm going to paraphrase because the quote is actually kind of long. I'm going to say again, paragraph 2 on page 1, the Jews have always been the enemies of Islam. Now, where does he get this from? Some of it is from classical Islamic writings, but Khomeini was a disciple and a follower of the chief ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Sayyid Qutb. Qutb was plain and simply a Nazi. And I'll give you one of many indicators. I will do an entire podcast or two even on Qutb. He's a very important character, and it's important to know who he was. But it's sufficient for our purposes that in the 1960s, before Nasser hanged him, Qutb wrote an extensive article called Our Struggle with the Jews. Now, if you don't recognize the literary reference of Our Struggle, Hitler's famous My Struggle is better known by its German title, Mein Kampf. Conjuring Hitler, Qutb says we have a struggle with the Jews, not with the Zionists, not with the Israelis, with the Jews. Nasrallah, head of Hezbollah, a few years ago, said in a public statement, we actually encourage all the Jews of the world to move to Israel, because that way we can kill them all in one place and we will not have to hunt them down throughout the world. Now, if that sounds a little Nazi to you, it's because it's more than a little Nazi. So where does that bring us to here? We have an organization that's gone through a number of phases. From its earliest organization phase through its suicide bombing stage. By the way, Hezbollah introduced suicide terrorism to the world and then quickly backed off of it, because Hezbollah is an extremely pragmatic, and always has been, an extremely pragmatic, rational organization. And here, I want to comment on that for a moment as well. And again, an opening to yet another podcast or series of. In the West, when we think rational, we kind of reject fanatical organizations. You're either rational or you're fanatic. As it turns out, that's not the case. Many of you who know me know that my educational background, my academic background is sociology. Did my graduate work at the University of Chicago, the Chicago School of Sociology, and I'm a follower of the school of the German sociologist Max Weber. If you're bored for a few hours, he's got a tremendous work that's about this thick called Economy and Society that's worth reading, but you don't have to. Weber dealt extensively with the idea of rationality, and I'm not going to give you his entire background thesis, simply the following. He said there are different types of rationality. There is what he called value rationality and instrumental rationality. Instrumental rationality is what we consider rationality today when we don't label it. In other words, doing things practically in a logical in order to achieve our goals. That's rational. If you're doing something that is not achieving your goal, that's irrational. But Weber said that's only one type of rationality. Value rationality is the separate rationality by which you establish your value system. And he emphasized the two have nothing to do with each other. In other words, you can be an absolute religious fanatic, like Yahya Sinwar, like Hassan Nasrallah, like Ayatollah Khomeini, and still behave rationally in attaining your goals. In other words, the fact that you are an extreme fanatic doesn't mean that you run around like a lunatic and not plan and operate in rational terms. And that's exactly what we're seeing today from both Iran and Hezbollah. These are not primitive people. They are not stupid people. Let's remember the Persians invented chess. They know how to play the game. And Nasrallah, with his many years of experience, has also learned to play the game. That doesn't mean it doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't mean the Iranians don't make mistakes. But everybody makes mistakes. I don't even want to go into the mistakes that Israel's made over the past number of years that brought us to where we are. So we have a rational organization that starts with suicide attacks. And the most infamous ones, of course, were the attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut, the two attacks on the American embassy in Beirut, the two attacks on the Israeli installation in Tyre, all of which caused casualties, in some cases huge numbers of casualties, 241 American servicemen and women in Beirut, but well over 100 Israelis in the two attacks on Tyre. However, once the world, at least in this part of the world, began to understand the nature of suicide attacks, they started to become less and less effective. And as soon as Hezbollah realized, and I'm talking about it in Lebanon in particular, as soon as Hezbollah realized that their effectiveness was dropping, they dropped them. Others picked up on them. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, Al-Qaeda. But Hezbollah backed away from them simply because they reached a stage where they said, we're not going to waste lives simply in order to show off that we're willing to commit suicide. And with that, and following the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000, under Imad Mughniyeh, who I mentioned earlier, and Fuad Shukr, who we took out last week, with the help of the Iranians, with tremendous support from the Iranians, shifted from a terrorist organization to a military organization. They're still terrorists, but they became an army. They went to war in 2006, not by intention. And we know very well, Nasrallah said it after the war in 2006, if I had known this was going to be the Israeli response, I never would have ordered the raid that started it in July 2006. But in the mistaken belief that he could get away with it, in the mistaken belief that that raid would lead to maybe a couple of days of Israeli counterstrikes and punitive strikes, and that would be the end of it, he ended up with a 34-day war that inflicted an enormous amount of damage on Lebanon and on Hezbollah. By the way, Sinwar and friends made the exact same calculation error in October this past year. They thought they were going to get what they'd gotten in the past, a few days or a week of Israeli bombardment, maybe a raid or two, and then everything would settle down to normal. And here, it didn't exactly work out that way. When the war ended in 2006, Hezbollah decided they were going to build for bigger and better. And where we are today is a situation, and this is true in Gaza as well, but I'm going to focus on Lebanon, a situation where for over 15 years, Israel has watched Hezbollah build, develop, dig tunnels using North Korean tunneling equipment, build up a rocket arsenal, build up an anti-tank arsenal. Incidentally, much of the damage that's being done along Israel's northern border is not being done by rockets, it's being done by anti-tank missiles. Building up an assault force called Redwan, which is capable of launching a direct attack across the border into Israel. And incidentally, prior to October 7th, the fear in Israel was much more of that kind of an attack by Hezbollah than by Hamas, which is in part how Hamas got away with it. And today, fighting a war of attrition against Israel with the certain belief that the next war will see the destruction of Israel. That's where we're sitting today. That's why we see Iran in the position that it is, and the Iranian leadership made a statement today that if their response leads to a general war, they look forward to it. It's rhetoric. Do they really look forward to it? I'm not sure, but we need to understand that we are today in a very dangerous point, having this huge convergence of both ideology, vicious exterminationist anti-Semitism, and Israeli and Western leadership that have permitted Iran and its organizations, Hezbollah primarily, but not only, to reach a point where they can actually stand and fight a war against Israel and against its allies. One final point, and I'm going to stop. Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran. Every time you hear somebody say the Iranian proxy Hezbollah, look at the screen, shake your head, and say, no, that's not true. Hamas is a proxy. Islamic Jihad is a proxy. Even the Houthis are proxies. The militias, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria are proxies. Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Quds Force of the IRGC. They take their orders directly. They are not independent. Nasrallah is under orders from Tehran. As a matter of fact, under the Trump administration, when Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, was taken out by the Americans, Nasrallah was offered his job. Think about that for a moment. Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite, was offered to become the head of the IRGC Quds Force of Iran. That gives you an idea of how tightly integrated Hezbollah is with the Iranian regime. So we've allowed it to happen. This is what we're facing today. And I'm not going to go into the Israeli side of it at this point. I wanted to cover background on Hezbollah, and that's what I've done. So in the future, I'll be putting up podcasts elaborating on many of the points that I made tonight, elaborating on the timeline of how we got from there to here. With that, I'll end at this point, and if there are questions, I will be happy to field them. Why do I think Hezbollah and Iran haven't responded yet to last week's attacks? I'll give you two reasons. Two possible reasons, and they're not necessarily contradicting each other. One is that they want to build up their coalition. Their plan is to respond in an integrated attack that includes Hezbollah, possibly Hamas. We saw today that Hamas still has rocket capability. The Houthis for sure. They need to move all their pieces into place, and they're in no hurry. And the second part of it is Israel, for the past week, has been partially paralyzed in anticipation. And why should they hurry? There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. I'm sure a lot of it being generated by them, that they're not going to do it until the 9th of Av. And then at the same time, they're going to do it tomorrow and everything in between. That type of uncertainty gives them partial success even before they fire the first shot. We know where Nasrallah is? Not exactly. We know he's somewhere underground in Beirut. In 2006, we dropped a building on him. He crawled out from under it. When he does appear, it's kind of Groundhog Day. He pops up, he looks around, he says a few things, and he scurries back underground again. And taking him out under those circumstances is very difficult. It emphasized the point that I made earlier, that the attacks that took out Shukr and Hania, coordinating two of those simultaneously in two different places, is very, very difficult. A few weeks ago, we took out Mohammed Def, the head of the military operations part of Hamas. It was based on an assumption that turned out to be true. There was an aircraft waiting in the air for hours for him to show up, and then he finally showed up. Let me see. Elon, what is the military power of Hezbollah? By the way, Elon, thank you very much for sending out the email that you did. I appreciate it. The military power of Hezbollah. Hezbollah fields an army of about 60,000, which is very large. Their capability is what would be termed in military terms light infantry. They have missile capability. They're well dug in. The Israeli advantage is in maneuverability, armor, air, and artillery, and my professional belief that our guys are still better trained and organized than theirs. And we're seeing that very clearly in Gaza with Hamas. How long would it take to take out most, like 80% of the missiles? If we can take out 30 or 40% of the missiles that Hezbollah has in a 72-hour period, I would consider that to be very successful. First of all, don't believe the numbers that are reported. The official numbers of 150,000 or 200,000 rockets, I think it's a gross underestimation. My personal estimate is between 300 and 350,000, and I won't go into why mine differs from the official. Only to say that official estimates invariably are underestimates for all sorts of very good reasons having to do with official. Israel knows where a lot of them are, and a lot of them are targetable. Hezbollah is moving them around now in anticipation of that. So, like anything else, we'll see. The Air Force is very good at what it does, and it's proven that over and over again. How successful will it be when push comes to shove? We'll see that only in retrospect. I'm trying to find other questions. As many of you know, I am devoutly low-tech, and I'm afraid that if I touch the screen the wrong way, it's all going to fail on me. All right, who do the Houthis follow, and are we afraid of the bigger war? So first of all, the Houthis follow the Iranians. The Iranians have backed them. They're part of the grand Iranian strategy of controlling sea lanes. It's a grand imperial strategy. They're not the first ones to think of it. And, those who've heard my lectures over the past 10 years or so know that I've mentioned this. The reason the Iranians are so interested in the Houthis is because of what we've seen since October. They've closed the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, the entry into the Red Sea, and that means they've essentially closed the Suez Canal. Why the world is not erupting on this and allowing Iran via the Houthis to cut off essentially, if not the most important, certainly one of the most important maritime commerce routes in the world is simply beyond me. Why don't we start it? Victor, a very good question, and I think with a very simple answer. Nobody wants to start a war, and if you look at the West in general, and Israel in particular, we've always waited too long. I'm thinking the United States in World War II, Roosevelt's statement in the days prior to Pearl Harbor, or actually the War Department, it would be best if the Japanese fired the first shot. And with the exception of the Six-Day War, when literally with the knife on Israel's throat, Israel decided to preempt, for the most part, Western countries in general, and Israel in particular, don't want to start. We're not begging Iran to do it. We're striking, we're hitting targets, we're doing much more damage than has been done in the past. We're in a different place than we were in the past. We've done it much more to Hamas than to anybody else. We've done a fair enough damage to Hezbollah as well. But let's also keep in mind that if Israel starts, our support from Europe in general and the United States in particular becomes very, very questionable. Keep in mind, Britain has already imposed an arms embargo on Israel. I'm going to say that again. Britain has imposed an arms embargo on Israel. And if you're thinking, well, what difference does that make? Israel gets its weapons from the United States. The F-35, that plane that America makes, has a large number of British components in it. Spare parts for the F-35 also come from Britain, and they are now not shipping them anymore. Strategically, I would say a bit problematic for Israel to start. If we have to, we will. But it's very, very important, given our situation, that we have Western support in general and American support in particular. Do I expect higher aid and support once a new U.S. leader is elected? I'm not going to presume who's going to be elected. I don't do American politics officially. I'll be happy to discuss it with you privately. But I'll say this. The issues that I have with American policy since October 7th has less to do with physical support than verbal support. And I want to be clear on this. America has provided Israel with a huge amount of munitions, and that's what we need, primarily munitions, not weapons. So we have the weapons, but war is a voracious consumer of munitions. And I'll give you just one interesting example. A lot of people made a big deal, and rightfully so, I think, of the U.S. withholding the heavy bombs, the Mark 84 bombs, to Israel a few months ago. And for good reason. The withholding of bombs during a war is problematic. But it's important to know that since October 7th, America has shipped 14,000 of those bombs to Israel. So, on the one hand, huge support. On the other hand, and the danger, in my opinion, is the impression that America's support is conditional, and that emboldens America's enemies and Israel's enemies, in particular, strengthening Hamas, strengthening Hezbollah, and strengthening Iran, pushing us pretty much to where we are today. Hezbollah destroy Israel financially by forcing it to defend itself. Look, war is a financial disaster. It's certainly an expensive prospect to take out cheap missiles, cheap rockets with expensive interceptors. But the danger to Israel of a full-scale war is not a financial one. The danger to Israel is a physical, structural, and I think it's something that we're capable of handling, but it's not going to be simple. Hezbollah does not violate agreements. It ignores them. Violating implies that it has some sort of recognition, and then it breaks it. Hezbollah simply does whatever it wants, and nobody's taken it to task for doing it. And that's why I don't believe that any agreement now, ceasefire or otherwise, brokered by America, France, or anybody else, is going to make any difference. It's 11 o'clock here, which makes it whatever time it is where you are, but there are 2 zeros at the end of the clock. So I'm going to end here. We scheduled for an hour. We'll keep to an hour. Thanks again for joining us. Look into the podcast. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.